The alarm bells are ringing louder and louder, and China is facing a mutiny. Yeah, a mutiny. Here's what it looks like. But wait, a mutiny against China should not be possible. The whole world witnessed how Hong Kong protests failed to make a difference, but this is different. It's a revolt against mortgage, and it's bringing the Chinese economy to its knees. Now, if you've been paying attention, the mortgage crisis is not to be taken lightly, and for China it's much more than that. GDP growth has stalled to its lowest pace in 4 decades. It stands at just 0.4%, a world away from the government's expectations of 5.5% for 2022. But to get the whole picture of how deep the rod runs, let's address the debt bomb. China's total public debt now exceeds 300% of GDP, 60% higher than the average across other countries. This net to GDP ratio is growing at 11% per year. China's GDP, though, has grown far less than 11% annually during the past decade, so the debt is comfortably outpacing growth. Youth unemployment is at 20%. The highest in recorded history, and then there's the war that has caused unprecedented supply chain headaches. China's middle-class consumers are already preparing for the economic winter as they rush to buy close to expired food at discounted rates. To top it all off, China is fighting an unwinnable fight against the pandemic. More on that later, but first, let's address the problem that's hastening China's economic decline: the property bubble. The property sector has essentially been the driver of the Chinese economy for 3 decades. As of 2022, real estate makes up 30% of the world's second largest economy. That's double the size of America's property sector and 3 times that of Europe. Ever since the 2008 recession, the Chinese stock market has remained stagnant, so real estate has been the preferred investment sector for most Chinese people. Right now, about 70% of household is tied up with real estate, but there's a big structural problem there. Most of the money generated in the market comes from pre-sold homes that make up 90% of all property sales, so the buyer pays the mortgage on a development that is yet to be completed. The developer takes the money, puts it into new projects. The existing projects are completed with borrowed money, and it practically becomes a Ponzi scheme where the asset does not exist. But what happens when the bank no longer provides the debt to cover construction? Developers are yet to deliver 40% of all the homes they sold between 2013 and 2020. Consumer confidence in the market is at an all-time low, and home prices have fallen for a record 11 months in a row. Things came to a head last month when thousands of home buyers came together to boycott mortgage installments. The boycotts have spread to at least 320 projects in 99 cities, making it perhaps the largest mortgage protest in China's history. Stop Mortgage is trending on China's social media sites. Developers are desperate and offering gifts to those still buying. The value of the mortgages affected by the boycotts amounts to $300 billion, which is just 5% of all mortgage lending. But the protests are symbolic of the wider trend of falling confidence in real estate. A frenzy has taken over China as property companies are now demolishing entire cities of half-finished buildings, with mortgage holders refusing to pay up. Many of the stalled projects may never be built. Thousands of partially completed buildings sit deserted across the country, with reports of as many as 50 million apartments being empty. New house sales have kept falling over the last 12 months, marking the longest decline since China restructured the private property market 3 decades ago. If home sales continue to plummet, 1 in 5 companies in China will go belly up. The inflated property bubble is on the verge of a crash. But did you know that most of this catastrophe is self-inflicted? Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping, back in the 60 seconds. Mao Zedong, the founder of today's China, was at the height of his popularity. He was revered by his countrymen as a father figure, but it was one of his economic policies that spelled disaster for the country. In 1958, Mao initiated the Great Leap Forward to shift the economy from agriculture to industry. However, what followed was the greatest famine in China's history, wiping out 50 million people. Many who survived were forced to eat grass, and Mao's legacy was never the same. For the most part of his rule, Xi Jinping has powered the Chinese dream, taking the country on the verge of overtaking the United States. However, in the wake of the pandemic, he signaled an economic restructuring through common prosperity, a policy that critics have labeled as the Great Leap Backwards. Under this policy, the state has introduced curbs on business, and the property sector has felt the most impact. Houses are for living in, not for speculation. Xi Jinping famously said this on many occasions and introduced policies to tame the construction sector. In August 2020, China issued the 3 red lines limiting how much developers could borrow. Less borrowing meant less money to complete projects, and soon we saw China become a country of ghost towns. China has at least 65 million empty homes, enough to house the population of France. It offers a glimpse into the country's massive housing market problem. With money drying up, the top 9 real estate companies in China have lost $79 billion of wealth since 2020. But there's one company in particular that triggered the decline, and may well take the world down with it. The company that is bringing down China. Evergrande is at the center of the crisis that is hurting China. The real estate giant owns 1,300 projects in 280 Chinese cities. But as Beijing started clamping down on borrowing, Evergrande lost access to capital. Most of its projects were stalled. The company started defaulting on its $300 billion debt, making it the most indebted company in the world. Evergrande has continuously missed debt deadlines. Its billion-dollar headquarters in Hong Kong is in receivership, while investors and homeowners have lined out in the streets to protest. The dark state fallout from Evergrande's episode is now spreading across the economy, with consumer confidence at its lowest in the property market. The biggest developers are looking at a slump. Country Garden, China's biggest developer by sales, reported a 96% plunge in net profit in the first half of the year. Out of 4,800 Chinese companies listed in Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing, 53% reported an earnings drop. That was close to the pandemic levels back in 2020, when 54% of listed companies posted a profit decline. By another measure though, the start of this year was worse. 900 companies recorded losses in the first half compared to 780 in 2020. So far, China has not made any extraordinary efforts to save Evergrande. Experts have drawn comparisons between Evergrande and former Wall Street giant Lehman Brothers, a company that was deemed too big to fail, but the United States decided to let it collapse during the 2008 recession. Whether China will try to save Evergrande remains to be seen. For now, there are major worries that other developers are following the same path. The hope for recovery dims further when you look at the draconian lockdown measures in place across the country 2.5 years after the pandemic. Most of the world has learned to live with the pandemic. China, on the other hand, has followed a strict zero-COVID policy, locking down major cities and closing ports. Also, the country only allows the use of Chinese vaccines, halting the way of a quick recovery in normal living. Across China, at least 74 cities have been closed off at different times in 2 weeks. 8 megacities have gone into full or partial lockdowns, and close to 300 million people have been cut off. According to Goldman Sachs estimates, cities impacted by lockdowns account for 35% of China's GDP. However, analysts don't see an end to the measures. China is so far deep into this policy that moving away from it now will cause a major disruption. More importantly, taking a step back now will make the original policy seem like a mistake. President Xi will not want to admit to a mistake, especially when he is so close to taking the office for a third time. In the meantime, China is facing a crash of everything, and the global impact of it may well be the preamble for another great recession. Global impact. China's collapses is hardly a cause with celebration for Western powers. Back in 2008, it was China that bailed out the world economy with a 586 billion stimulus. But we are now in 2022 and the whole world, not just China, is at risk. China's economy accounts for 1/5 of global GDP, and many countries thrive off trade with China. But with the property sector coming to a standstill and GDP growth inching towards zero, China is facing a crisis of demand. The country needs less iron and steel, less timber, less coal, and a lot less oil. So trade partners like Brazil, Australia, Malaysia, and the Middle East will feel the impacts. For example, China purchases 34% of Brazilian exports, generating a trade surplus of approximately $33 billion for the South American country. Then there's the United States. Despite the aggressive posturing, the world's two leading economies remain each other's biggest trading partners. The United States purchases more than $300 billion of Chinese goods each year. U.S. pension funds, individuals, and investors have $2.1 trillion tied up in Chinese companies listed on American exchanges. China's foreign currency debt stands at $2.4 trillion, and a slumping China puts all of it at risk. And it's not just the West. Sellers of energy and coal, like Mongolia, and raw material and mineral exporters in Africa are all feeling the impacts of reduced demand. China's Belt and Road Initiative has projects worth $1 trillion in 139 countries around the globe. If Chinese real estate fails, the whole world could be left with unfinished buildings, unpaved roads, and unattended power generation plants. According to the World Economic Forum, every percentage decrease in China's GDP causes a 0.3% contraction in the world economy. So anything that's ailing China is ailing the world. 2008 was a crisis of mortgage. It was the crash of housing, but this is the crash of everything. There's a gas shock in Europe, interest rate hikes in the US, and a real estate crisis exacerbated by never-ending lockdowns in China. A combined effect of it all is a giant cloud of a global recession. The threat is big enough for a consensus that a cold winter is coming for consumers everywhere. China might be at the forefront, but no one is safe. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to our channel. We look forward to your comments underneath this video.